Let's talk about a time not so long ago when Canada, a country over a century old, was on the very brink of tearing itself apart. Seriously, this is a story all about power, tradition, and how one really surprising court decision basically forced an entire nation to finally grow up.
It really boils down to this question. How does a country truly become its own? Is it the day you declare independence or raise a new flag? Or is it the moment you can finally write and rewrite your own rules, completely on your own terms? For Canada, well, that last part, that was the big problem. And the official word for this process is patriation. Sounds kind of fancy, but it's really just a formal term for a pretty simple idea: bringing a country's most important document, its constitution, home. For Canada, that meant bringing it home from Great Britain. Okay, think of it like this. Imagine a professional sports team. They've got their own stadium, their own star players, their own die-hard fans. But every single time they want to change even a minor rule about how they play the game, they have to send a letter across the ocean and ask the original founders of the league for permission. I mean, it sounds absurd, right? But for over 100 years, that was literally Canada's reality. So this gets us to the heart of the issue. Canada's founding document was, for all intents and purposes, unfinished business. Just look at this timeline for a second. Canada is formed way back in 1867, but its constitution stays as an act of the British Parliament. Then, in 1931, the country gets full control over its own laws, with one massive exception: the Constitution itself. For the next 50 years, leader after leader tried and failed to find a solution. And by 1980, let me tell you, patience had completely run out. So, with the country stuck in this political jam for generations, the federal government decided it was time for a dramatic and, yeah, a very controversial move. Their plan was, well, it was breathtakingly audacious. The federal government had this vision for a new charter of rights and freedoms, and they decided that if the provinces wouldn't agree to it, they were just going to act alone. They planned to completely bypass the provincial governments and ask the British Parliament one last time to change the Constitution and finally send it home for good. As you can probably guess, this whole "we're going it alone" approach did not go over well. It basically ignited a political firestorm, pitting the central government against a really powerful majority of the provinces. Just how big was the opposition? Get this: 8 out of the 10 provinces formally united against the federal government's plan. This wasn't just a simple disagreement anymore. This was a full-blown constitutional crisis. And here you can see the two competing visions for the country laid bare. On one side, you have the federal government arguing that a national majority in parliament is enough to make this happen. But on the other side, you've got this coalition of 8 provinces. They were actually nicknamed the Gang of 8, and they were insisting that, hey, Canada is a federation. They were worried about losing their own powers, and they argued you just can't fundamentally change the rules of the country without substantial agreement from the provinces themselves. So, with the politicians at a total standstill and the entire country basically holding its breath, the whole fight moved from the halls of Parliament to the nation's highest court. The Supreme Court managed to boil this whole massive crisis down to just 2 essential questions. First, was the government's plan strictly legal? Like, according to the letter of the law, could they do it? And second, and this is the deeper question, did the plan violate Canada's constitutional conventions? You know, the powerful, unwritten rules and traditions that had always held the country together. And this was it. This was the ultimate question: the fate of the country's founding document. And, maybe the country itself was hanging on the answer. So what did the court deliver? Well, it wasn't a simple yes or no. It was something way more nuanced, way more complex. It was a nation-defining paradox. So here's the court's incredible, paradoxical answer. To that first question, was it strictly legal? They said yes. Technically, by the letter of the law, the federal government had the power. But to the second question, did it follow the unwritten rules? They said no. The plan was legal but unconstitutional. It violated this deep-seated principle that major changes require a substantial degree of provincial consent. And this quote from the decision became legendary. The court basically said that the spirit of the Constitution, the traditions and conventions that make it all work, was just as important as the words written on the page. Suddenly, consensus wasn't just a nice political idea. It was now a constitutional requirement. And the effect of this was immediate and huge.
The federal government had the legal right to go ahead, but the court had just stripped them of the moral and constitutional authority to do it. The provinces, they'd won on principle, but they couldn't actually stop the federal government on legal grounds alone. It was a perfect stalemate.
But here's the thing. The court's paradoxical ruling actually did something kind of brilliant. It forced everyone back to the negotiating table. Since neither side could claim a total victory, they had no choice but to compromise. And in one final, dramatic, late-night negotiation, they hammered out a deal. And in 1982, Canada's constitution finally came home.
So what did all this lead to? I mean, the results were just monumental. Canada got a brand new Made in Canada Constitution Act. For the very first time, it had its own formula for making changes in the future. And, most famously of all, it got the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a document that has really defined the country's identity ever since. You know, in the end, this whole Canadian saga reveals a really powerful truth. It makes you ask, which is more powerful? The law that's actually written down on the page, or the unwritten rules we all just agree to follow? For Canada, it turned out that a court recognizing those unwritten rules didn't break the country. It actually helped to build one.